The world believed it knew Patricia Hearst. She was not just a person, she was a symbol. The quiet 20-year-old granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst, the ultimate newspaper tycoon. She was an heiress to an American dynasty, a student at Berkeley, a figure of inherited privilege, living a life defined by quiet luxury and a looming, comfortable marriage. But on April 15, 1974, a grainy black and white security camera feed from the Hibernia Bank in San Francisco showed the world someone new. A gaunt figure in a dark beret, clutching a heavy M1 carbine, her voice sharp and metallic as she barked orders at terrified civilians. This was not Patricia. This was Tania. If you were alive in 1974, if you remember the crackle of the AM radio and the grim faces of news anchors like Walter Cronkite, you remember the profound shock. The audio tapes that followed, her voice denouncing her pig family, were a cultural earthquake. But that bank footage was more than a crime. It was a question that froze America. Was this a brainwashed victim, a puppet controlled by unseen forces? Or was she the nation's most terrifying new convert to violent revolution? The truth, buried beneath decades of FBI files and sensationalist headlines, was far stranger and far darker than anyone dared to imagine. But what truly happened in the 59 days leading to that robbery, inside a cramped, suffocating closet, would define the entire saga. It began not with a gun, but with the sound of a door slamming shut and the click of a lock. The date was February 4th, 1974. America was a nation on edge. The Watergate scandal was metastasizing, consuming the Nixon presidency. The Vietnam War, a wound that refused to close, was still claiming lives. The soundtrack of the era, the introspective folk of Joni Mitchell and the glam rock of David Bowie, felt like a nervous breakdown set to music. In this atmosphere of deep national cynicism, Berkeley, California was the epicenter of student radicalism. But Patty Hearst was not a radical. She lived quietly in apartment number 4 with her 26-year-old fiancé, Stephen Weed, a former prep school math teacher. They were planning a wedding. Their life was one of academic routine and domestic comfort, utterly insulated by the vast, invisible fortress of the Hearst family fortune. That fortress was breached at 9:17 p.m. It was a violent, chaotic rupture. A knock at the door, a woman's voice claiming she had been in a car accident. When Weed opened the door, the Symbionese Liberation Army stormed in. It was a brutal, disorganized assault. 2 men, 1 black and 1 white, and a white woman, all armed. They were not professionals. They were frantic, screaming. Weed was beaten viciously with a wine bottle. His skull fractured, left semi-conscious in a pool of blood. Patty, kicking and screaming in her blue bathrobe, was blindfolded, gagged, and half-carried, half-dragged out of the apartment. She was thrown into the trunk of a stolen Chevrolet. The entire abduction from start to finish took less than 3 minutes. The neighbors who witnessed it were so stunned, they could barely describe what they had seen. The SLA, a group so obscure that the media initially struggled to spell its name, had just pulled off the most sensational kidnapping in modern American history. Their leader was Donald DeFreeze, a man who represented the darkest, most delusional fringe of 1970s radicalism. An escaped convict, he had rebranded himself as General Field Marshal Cinque, the leader of a united federated forces. His army consisted of a handful of disillusioned, middle-class white radicals who had adopted his bizarre militant ideology. Their first communique, sent to a local radio station, was rambling and incoherent. But their target was precise. They hadn't just kidnapped a girl. They had kidnapped a headline. They didn't demand cash. They demanded food for the people. Specifically, they demanded that the Hearst Corporation finance a 70 per person food giveaway for every person with a Social Security card in California. The cost was estimated at a staggering $400 million. It was impossible, absurd, and a brilliant piece of political theater. Randolph Hearst, Patty's father, was trapped. He was living every parent's most primal, universal fear. The utter powerlessness of watching your child be consumed by forces you cannot control. A nightmare all the money in the world cannot end. He went on television, his face etched with a pain that transcended his immense wealth, pleading with the anonymous shadows who held his daughter. He agreed to a counteroffer, a $2 million food distribution program named People in Need, or PIN. It was a catastrophic failure. The logistics were impossible. Thousands swarmed the distribution points. Riots broke out as people fought over frozen turkeys. The SLA, watching the chaos unfold, deemed the effort a mockery, and in their next audio tape, they called Randolph Hearst a liar. The negotiation was over. And for Patty, the real horror was just beginning. The world outside saw the failing food program and the desperate father. But inside a series of cramped, squalid safe houses, Patty's reality was shrinking. It shrank to the size of the closet she was kept in, and to the sound of one single dominant voice, Donald DeFreeze. Soon that voice would offer her a choice that was not a choice at all. For 57 days, she was systematically broken. This was not a simple hostage situation. It was a textbook case of psychological deconstruction. She was kept in a closet, barely large enough to lie down in. She was blindfolded continuously for weeks. She was told she was a prisoner of war, and that the War Council was debating her execution. She was fed just enough to keep her alive, but starved enough to induce disorientation. She was isolated, terrified, and completely dependent on her captors for everything: food, water, and permission to use the bathroom. And then came the sexual assault. According to her later testimony, she was raped by multiple members of the group, an act of revolutionary dominance to shatter her bourgeois identity. Alongside this physical torture was a relentless wave of indoctrination. DeFreeze, or Tinke, would sit outside her closet for hours, his voice a constant hypnotic presence, lecturing her on the crimes of her fascist insect family. He made her read their manifestos, their bizarre blend of Maoist rhetoric and street gang posturing. She was told her fiancé, Stephen Weed, had abandoned her, that her family didn't truly love her, that they were letting her die rather than meet the SLA's demands. They told her the FBI was plotting to kill her during any rescue attempt, that her only chance of survival was with them. They were creating what psychologists call an identification with the aggressor. To survive, her mind had to find a way to align with the only power in her new, terrifying universe, the SLA. Then, on April 3, 1974, came the tape that electrified the nation. It was tape number 4. The voice was hers, but the words were alien. "Mom, Dad," she began, her voice flat, devoid of emotion, "I have been given a choice to be released, or to join the forces of the Symbionese Liberation Army and fight for my freedom and the freedom of all oppressed people." She then announced she had chosen to stay. She had adopted a new name, Tania, after Heyday Tamara Bunky Biter, the German-born revolutionary who had fought and died with Che Guevara in Bolivia. She denounced her former life. She denounced Stephen Weed as a sexist, ageist pig. She denounced her father as the corporate military enemy. This was the ultimate betrayal. It confirmed their worst fears about the radical youth movement, that it wasn't just about long hair and protest songs, but about a dark, cult-like force that could steal their children and turn them into monsters. The FBI was baffled. Hostage negotiators were stunned. Was it a trick? Was she reading a script with a gun to her head? Or had the closet-sized re-education actually worked? The SLA knew they needed to answer that question. They needed to prove to the world, and perhaps to themselves, that Tania was real. The SLA's proof of conversion would not be another audio tape. It would be a public performance staged in broad daylight, with loaded weapons and a rolling camera. The target was the Hibernia Bank branch at 1450 Noriega Street, chosen specifically for its high-mounted, wide-angle security camera. On the morning of April 15, 1974, just 12 days after her Tania tape, the SLA cell moved in. Donald DeFreeze led the charge, followed by 4 other members. And with them, Patty Hearst. She was no longer a prisoner. She was a soldier. Dressed in a dark wig, a beret, and a long coat, she carried a P1M1 carbine, a semi-automatic rifle. The robbery was fast, brutal, and chaotic. They stormed the bank screaming, "This is Tania! Patricia Hearst!" The security footage, silent but damning, captured the moment that would define the entire scandal. Patty is seen standing in the center of the lobby, weapon held professionally, shouting orders. When a 70-year-old man, a bystander, made a move, she was seen firing a burst from her rifle into the ceiling, showering the lobby with plaster. 2 civilians were shot and wounded by the other SLA members during the frantic $10,000 theft. As they fled, Tania was heard screaming at a bystander outside, "Get your heads down or I'll blow your fucking heads off." The footage was a devastating blow to the Hearst family and any hope of painting Patty as a simple victim. The image of the heiress as a gun-toting revolutionary was seared into the American consciousness. It was more powerful than any audio tape. It was visceral, undeniable proof. The quiet sophomore was gone and Tania was a bank robber. The robbery was a tactical success but a profound strategic blunder. The SLA and Tania with them were now the most wanted criminals in America. The full power of the FBI, energized by the public outrage, was brought to bear. This began the lost year. Patty, along with the group, vanished into the radical underground. They moved from one squalid safe house to another, a bizarre, nomadic existence fueled by paranoia and the dwindling adrenaline of their revolution. But the group, already unstable, was beginning to disintegrate. Their ideology was a patchwork of slogans, and their leader, DeFries, was becoming increasingly erratic and violent. The end of the original SLA was coming, and it would be as public and as violent as their first appearance. Just 1 month later, on May 17, 1974, an anonymous tip led the Los Angeles Police Department to a small, yellow stucco house at 1466 East 54th Street in Compton. 6 members of the SLA, including Donald DeFries, were inside. Patty and 2 others, Bill and Emily Heiress, were not. What followed was not an arrest. It was a siege. It was one of the first and most dramatic live televised shootouts in American history. For those old enough to remember, the images are unforgettable. Hundreds of LAPD officers, including the newly formed SWAT team, surrounded the tiny house. A firefight erupted, a terrifying one-sided battle. Over 9,000 rounds of ammunition were fired into the building. The SLA members, armed with automatic weapons, returned fire, but they were hopelessly outgunned. Tear gas canisters were lobbed into the house, which soon caught fire. The nation watched, live for 2 hours, as the structure was consumed by smoke and flames. No one came out. By the time the fire was extinguished, all 6 SLA members inside, including General Cinque Donald DeFries, were dead. The organization that had terrorized California was, for all intents and purposes, annihilated. The assumption and the hope was that the nightmare was finally over. But it wasn't. Patty Hearst was still out there, and she was still Tania. With DeFries dead, Patty's controller was gone. The psychological spell, if there was one, should have been broken. She was free to surrender, to return home, to claim her victimhood. She didn't. She chose to stay, binding her fate to the last 2 surviving members, Bill and Emily Heiress. This next 16-month period is the most complex and most damning part of the Patty Hearst story. She was no longer a prisoner. She was a fugitive. This was no longer about survival. It was about commitment. She, Bill, and Emily Heiress became a nomadic terror cell, drifting across the country from California to the East Coast and back again. They needed money to survive, so they kept robbing. Their most tragic crime occurred on April 21, 1975, almost a year after the Hibernia robbery. They targeted the Crocker National Bank in Carmichael, a suburb of Sacramento. It was another poorly planned, desperate robbery. During the commission of the crime, 42-year-old Myrna Opsahl, a local doctor's wife and mother of 4, was depositing a church collection. She was shot and killed by a shotgun blast. Decades of conflicting reports and sealed testimonies would debate who fired the fatal shot. But the fact was undisputed. Patty Hearst was there. She was a knowing participant in the robbery, driving one of the getaway cars. The line had been crossed irrevocably. This was no longer political theater or a confused girl playing revolutionary. This was murder. The urban guerrilla lifestyle was anything but glamorous. Recently uncovered archival notes from the FBI's investigation paint a picture of a grim, paranoid existence. They lived in squalor, constantly arguing, their revolutionary ideals having evaporated, leaving only the cold, hard reality of their crimes. Patty, the heiress raised in mansions, was now a ghost, dyeing her hair, learning to live off the grid, forever looking over her shoulder. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by the dull, grinding fear of the inevitable. The end came quietly. On September 18, 1975, FBI agents, acting on a tip, surrounded a modest apartment in San Francisco. When they burst through the door, the woman they found was not the defiant Tania from the bank camera. She was 21 years old, emaciated, weighing less than 90 pounds, her hair dyed a cheap red. She was terrified, As she was being arrested, a small, hopeful smile flickered across her face, a smile of relief. The running was over, but when the arresting agent asked her to state her occupation for the booking form, she replied in a small voice, "Urban guerrilla." The transformation was complete. The battle for her soul, however, was just beginning. The Hearst family, relieved to have their daughter back but horrified by the charges, did what they did best. They hired the best. The stage was set for the trial of the century, and their defense attorney was F. Lee Bailey, the rock star lawyer of the era, the man who had won an impossible acquittal for the Boston Strangler. Bailey's defense would be built on a concept so new to the American public that it sounded like science fiction: coercive persuasion, or as it would come to be known, Stockholm Syndrome. The 1976 trial was a media circus, the O.J. Simpson trial of its day. Bailey's defense was simple and elegant. Patty Hearst did not rob that bank. Tania did. He argued that the 57 days in the closet, the sensory deprivation, the starvation, the rape, and the relentless indoctrination had completely destroyed her personality. He claimed she was a victim of brainwashing, a puppet who had no free will. The prosecution, led by James L. Browning Jr., had an equally simple and far more powerful counter-argument: the bank camera. They played the footage over and over. They showed the jury the image of Tania, alert, professional, and in command. They brought in witnesses who testified she was a willing participant. They pointed to the 16 months she spent on the run after DeFreeze. Her controller was dead. They argued she was a spoiled rich kid who had found a twisted form of rebellion, a common criminal hiding behind a fancy psychological theory. The trial became a battle of expert witnesses. Defense psychiatrists like Robert J. Lifton testified that she was a classic case of a coerced convert. Prosecution psychiatrists argued she was a malingerer, faking her symptoms, a queen in a revolutionary fantasy. The defense's case took a fatal blow when they put Patty herself on the stand. She was a terrible witness. Coached by Bailey to appear robotic and brainwashed, she came across as cold, arrogant, and evasive. She claimed she couldn't remember large portions of the lost year. During cross-examination, she frequently pleaded the Fifth Amendment. Instead of an empathetic victim, the jury saw an unrepentant criminal. The jury's decision would ultimately shock the Hearst family and F. Lee Bailey to their core. But the most damning piece of evidence wasn't the bank footage or the audio tapes. It was a small, insignificant object found in her pocket on the day of her arrest. It was a small carved wooden lion. It had been given to her by Willie Wolfe, one of the SLA members, the one who had allegedly been her lover. She had kept it with her through the entire 16-month fugitive ordeal. For the prosecution, this was the smoking gun. This was not the keepsake of a terrified victim. It was a love token. It symbolized her emotional bond, her choice to be one of them. It shattered the defense's narrative of total mind control. On March 20th, 1976, after deliberating for just 12 hours, the jury returned their verdict. Guilty on all counts, including armed bank robbery. The Stockholm Syndrome defense had failed. Patricia Campbell Hearst was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. Patty Hearst, member of American royalty, was now federal prisoner number 19313-111. But the Hearst machine, the powerful media and political empire her grandfather had built, did not stop working. The fight simply moved from the courtroom to the highest levels of power in Washington, D.C. Her imprisonment was a shock, but she was still a Hearst. Randolph Hearst, who had already spent millions on her defense, activated every political connection he had. A massive committee for the release of Patricia Hearst was formed. The same cultural elite who had scorned her as a radical now rallied to her cause, signing petitions and painting her as a victim of a broken, vindictive justice system. The political pressure was immense. In 1979, after she had served only 22 months, President Jimmy Carter, known for his focus on human rights, commuted her sentence. She was released. She walked out of prison, not into the arms of a revolutionary cell, but into the arms of her bodyguard, Bernard Shaw. She married him just 2 months later. She attempted to disappear into the life she was always supposed to have, the life of a wealthy socialite. She had 2 children. She became a normal suburban mother in Connecticut, but the ghost of Tania lingered. She wrote a tell-all book, Every Secret Thing, where she, for the first time, detailed the horrific sexual and psychological abuse in the closet, reinforcing the victim narrative that had failed in court. For decades, she lived a quiet life. But one crime remained unsolved, a dark shadow over her new life. The 1975 bank robbery in Carmichael, the one where Myrna Opsahl was murdered. The case had gone cold for 27 years. Tania was gone, but the consequences of her actions were not. In 2002, new forensic technology and a determined prosecutor allowed the state to reopen the Carmichael murder case. Patty Hearst, now 47 years old, a respectable mother and socialite, was once again facing charges related to her time with the SLA. To avoid a new, potentially devastating trial for second-degree murder, she made a final deal. She pled guilty to a lesser charge in exchange for her testimony against the other surviving SLA members. It was the final quiet act. She had to finally legally admit her role, but the story has one last surreal twist. On January 20th, 2001, in the final hours of his presidency, President Bill Clinton gave Patty Hearst something President Carter had not: a full and unconditional presidential pardon. Her original 1976 bank robbery conviction was wiped clean. The transformation was complete, not by revolution but by law and political influence. Today, Patricia Hearst Shaw is a socialite. She appears in high-profile dog shows with her prize-winning French bulldogs. She has had cameo roles in films by the counterculture director John Waters. It is a bizarre epilogue to one of the most violent and psychologically disturbing chapters in American history. The story of Patty Hearst remains a cultural touchstone because it represents the moment the 1960s dream of peace and love officially died, replaced by the paranoia, violence, and cynical media manipulation of the 1970s. The question of who was she was never truly answered. Was she the brainwashed victim in the closet, or the defiant terrorist Tania? The most likely and most human answer is that she was, for a time, both.